So bienvenidos to our second LHC membership webinars program of 2025. It's incredible to think that we hosted our first program in December of 2023, and we are excited to continue providing a space for important conversations on Latinx heritage conservation. Today's presentation is titled Reforming Architectural Conservation, Una Plática, and our panelists include Dr. Jeremy C. Wells and Héctor J. Berdecía-Hernández. I'd also like to remind you all that for members, we also have our Cafecitos con LHC. Mark your calendar for July 31st. This is one of our monthly programs that we do last Thursday of every month with a different staff member from LHC. This month is with Jennifer Rivera Velez, our communications outreach coordinator. That's another perk of your membership. And of course, as well, mark your calendars and save the date for Wednesday, September 17th. It's gonna be a little bit early at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. We're gonna have a Plática with staff from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, as well as LHC. So mark your calendars for that. Members, you will be getting your email reminders as well. All right, and finally, we are recording this presentation. So members do receive live access to webinars where they can ask our presenters questions directly, as well as early access to our recordings. As soon as this presentation is done and recorded, you'll be getting a link just in case you missed anything. And it will also be publicly posted on our website a week from today. So you can visit our website to see all of our past recordings. And for those who are not members, we invite you to join LHC. Our new membership levels include yearly and monthly payment plans, and they have all types of benefits, including our members-only quarterly newsletter, live access to membership webinars like today, and our monthly Cafecitos con LHC, also a login for the La Plaza online forum, and much more. And of course, we also have our new this year community supporter membership levels, which include all of those benefits plus extra La Plaza logins and extra webinar attendees, as well as some options for custom presentations for your organization and even speaking opportunities at LHC events. These are great giving levels for corporations and organizations. Please consider a donation to help us continue this important work, que vale la pena. And if you're already a member, thank you for your continued support. We appreciate you spreading the word about LHC and the amazing things we do together. With that, I'll pass it over to today's MC, our very own Hilary Morales Robles. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hilary Morales Robles. I am your Historic Preservation Officer and also the Endangered Latinx Landmarks Program Manager. So anything related to built environment, that's on me. So today we welcome today's webinar hosted by us. And before we get started, I want to go some quick housekeeping engagement guidelines to help us create a respectful, inclusive space for today's conversation. As Janet mentioned, we're going to be recording this webinar that will be available to you all after this meeting. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation portions of the event to minimize background noise. You're welcome to turn on your camera on and off, whatever feels comfortable to you. When we move to we're going to have a conversation style webinar, so it's just, raise your hand and we're going to let you speak. Feel free to also use our chat to communicate directly, and we'll be happily delegating the conversation to you as well. Please engage respectfully and thoughtfully. This space is intended to uplift diverse voices, so please keep your comments constructive and grounded in curiosity, generosity, and care. And finally, while we're engaging in a critical conversation today, this is also a space for community. We invite you to speak from your own experiences and to really listen when others are doing the same. So we're going to learn together. With that, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. We're honored to have two outstanding experts with us, Jeremy Wells and Héctor Berdecía-Hernández, who co-authored the important paper. I'm excited about that paper. It's titled Reforming Architectural Conservation Pedagogy in the United States to Disrupt Euro-American Supremacy in its Theories. So first, talking about Jeremy, not to say, he's really cool. He's an award-winning scholar artist whose work uniquely blends historic preservation theory with social justice and community-centered approaches. He has a strong background as a tenure professor and researcher, and he brings a deeply interdisciplinary perspective by combining his academic expertise with his work as a musical artist. Jeremy's scholarship focuses on how historic preservation and heritage conservation can be made more accountable and people-centered, breaking away from traditional models that often exclude marginalized voices. His upcoming book, titled Managing the Magic of All Places, Crafting Public Policies for Human-Centered Historic Preservation, promises to be a groundbreaking contribution to the field. So stay tuned. Then we have our wonderful Héctor Berdecía-Hernández, as a fellow Puerto Rican, a cultural heritage conservator and leader based in Puerto Rico, who brings an impressive interdisciplinary expertise in preserving historic buildings, outdoor sculptures, and heritage collections. Héctor is the founding Director General of the Centro de Conservación Restauración de Puerto Rico, where he drives strategic initiatives that respond to both cultural heritage challenges and community needs. He is deeply involved in education, teaching both undergraduate and graduate courses focused on cultural heritage conservation. Héctor's academic background spans historic preservation, museum studies, conservation science, and nonprofit management. He has many other roles too, because he's always, he's so smart. Reflecting his commitment to integrating multiple perspectives into preservation practice. His research emphasizes vernacular architecture, traditional materials, and sustainable development, all through a lens that critically examines public policy and heritage conservation's role in social equity. So together, both Jeremy and Hector, they explore how the field of architectural conservation in the U.S. has roots in European tradition, especially the Italian English schools that carry embedded biases, including Euro-American supremacy and exclusion of marginalized voices. Their paper shows how these doctrines shape current preservation policies, after focusing on ideas like minimal intervention, authenticity, and unity, which can overlook or even conflict with the lived experiences of our communities. So with that said, I'm gonna open the floor for them to talk more about the beautiful project.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, all the staff of Latinos in Heritage Conservation for having us today. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're excited to share a little bit about the paper that we wrote and having a great conversation with you all. So let me see if I can share my screen quick. Can you see the screen? Perfect. So, today we have this presentation, which is based on an article that we wrote for Conservation 360. It's an international journal on conservation. Specifically, this article was, this edition of Conservation 360 was focused on pedagogy or education around the world. So it's basically an international journal, and there were a lot of other articles, but specifically we wanted to focus on architectural conservation in the US. In recent years, there has been a growing and long overdue recognition of the need to center diversity, equity, and inclusion in the cultural heritage fields. But despite this momentum, heritage conservation, particularly in architectural practice, often remains trapped in outdated paradigm that excludes the very communities we claim to serve. What does it mean when a field that is supposed to care for all of our histories continues to privilege some narratives over others? Today we aim to challenge the orthodoxy, the dominant assumptions, theories, and practices that have shaped architectural conservation in the United States and question whose heritage it truly protects. Immediately, we're thinking about the paper's central argument, which is that orthodox architectural conservation theories in the US, which are the base of all of the practice and graduate conservation programs, are built on and sustain an Euro-American supremacy. This basically theory is present at the core of the practice and pedagogy, as we mentioned. These foundational theories also are largely inherited from European intellectual traditions that have been treated as universally applicable. Yet they were never designed to speak to the life realities and worldviews or heritage values of indigenous, Black, Latinos, Asian, or other historically marginalized communities. By failing to interrogate this orthodoxy, we risk preserving not just buildings, objects, and intangible heritage, but also structures of exclusion and epistemic dominance.
Okay. Thank you, Hector. So I'm going to, as I've said, be sort of the sandwich, the middle of the sandwich in this particular presentation. So I'm going to start off here with defining Euro-American supremacy, but I need to talk about a foundational idea that this is based on, and that is the doctrines and public policies in historic preservation that are used in the US. And the key concept to understand here is that the doctrines and policies that drive historic preservation practice in the US, and it's about 3/4 of all paid practice in the US, have not changed to any significant degree for about a half of a century. And so Euro-American supremacy is in part defined by the way that the past is literally being brought to us here in the present through the doctrines and especially the public policies that are used here in the United States. And so Euro-American supremacy is based on a set of primary beliefs, and we've taken these, we borrowed them from some other authors, and we've adapted it here to an architectural conservation context. But it's primarily a belief in the supposed superiority of ideas of white European and American men. And again, think, this is like a worldview 50 years ago. It's defined by a belief in the supposed superiority of doctrine, the doctrine that are created by these individuals. It's defined by a belief in the need for individuals who are living today who have dominant identities, who define most of the people who practice in historic preservation, that there's some sort of a responsibility that those individuals actually have to sustain this orthodox doctrine, often by law, because they have to follow the law, which is part of that process. It's a belief that students must be taught to accept and promulgate this doctrine. And lastly, the way this gets defended is through calls to authority. Next. And so when I talk about the doctrine and policy that's created in the US, the interesting thing is that less than 100 people from the time period from about 1850 until around 1980 or so, when doctrine and policy became fixed in the US, only less than 100 people were involved in creating this, an architectural conservation doctrine and policy. Almost all of them were men. The predominant places these people were from the US, England, and Italy. They were predominantly white. They were very highly educated. And the interesting thing is that almost half of these individuals from 1850 to 1980 had graduate degrees. And that's just exceptional. And of those individuals with degrees, and again, most of them, about a third of them were from elite universities. Yeah, go ahead next. A small group of these individuals that are known by scholars as the Italian school were uniquely responsible for creating some of the key concepts that are used in architectural conservation doctrine and policy. And they are ideas around minimal intervention, artistic or aesthetic unity, and authenticity. And the way those ideas manifest in especially public policy in the US is through the integrity definition in the National Register of Historic Places and through the Secretary of the Interior standards. Next. So Why is this a social justice issue? Because that's one of the core things we're talking about in this paper. Well, first and foremost, this is an issue of exclusion because we're talking about the development and fixation of doctrine and public policy in the US a half a century ago. And so people with minoritized identities were just simply not at the table. They were not part of the discussion. They were never even considered to be part of the discussion. It's an issue around what scholars call material fetish, which is a fancy way of saying that historic preservation doctrine and policy really, really emphasizes the idea that a certain amount of fabric or building materials from historic buildings have to be present in order to maintain authenticity and the supposition that this is a genuinely historic building, which works great if you're talking about high style buildings with a lot of artistic value, because those tend to survive in a more intact way from the past to the present than do more vernacular landscapes and vernacular buildings that are more commonly associated with marginalized communities. It's an issue around the biases that the historical figures absorbed because they were living in a time period that had many racial biases in it, and their biases became incorporated into doctrine and policy. And what this all adds up to is a question: is what's the relevancy of a body of doctrine and public policy that was entirely created without the input of a huge number of Americans in the country today? Next. So there's a few ways to think about how we might move forward from this. And the first one is to think about how can we move beyond materiality? How can we look at the tangible and the intangible? It's not excluding the tangible, but it's like, what's that balance look like? And that discussion needs to happen. Next. And one of the ways that we can inform this is through evidence that we can collect from the social sciences. And one of the most promising areas is from environmental psychology. And this is an interesting link with that Italian school, those people from Italy who created early doctrine. They were using what's called Gestalt psychology, which is an early form of environmental psychology that informed their theories. And they were interested in people's embodied lived experience, really only their embodied lived experience, I should clarify. The difference is that today, 100 years later, we have a lot more understanding about what environmental psychology is. And more importantly, we absolutely fundamentally understand the need to involve people with more diverse identities in this particular work, something that never would have happened in the past. Next. And lastly, we need to think about pedagogical reform. I mean, that's another core part of this paper. We need to think about how can the education of students in historic preservation and architectural conservation programs in the US, how does that need to change? Okay. Over to you, Hector.
So if we want this field to matter in the 21st century, to remain relevant, equitable, and responsive, we must normalize questioning orthodoxy. And I think this has been the central idea of this discussion. It doesn't mean abandoning rigor or care. It means expanding our frameworks to reflect the pluralism of the societies we work in. We need to be brave enough to rethink what we have inherited, and humble enough to listen to perspective the field has long marginalized. Only then architectural conservation truly serve all communities, not just those that it was originally built to protect. So if you want to look at the full article, feel free to reach out. I think the link is already on the chat, but here is the journal, Education and Pedagogy, is on the Conservation 360 journal. And obviously, if you have any specific questions for us, here are our emails. So feel free to reach out, and looking forward for a great conversation with you all. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks, Hector. So I'm going to lead off the conversation with actually recognition that we've absolutely blasted through an incredible density of material in a very short period of time. But we don't want to be the typical academics that lecture to you and then you leave going, gosh, I had all these questions. And so certainly if you have things that you didn't understand, you want to talk about let us know. But I would suggest one way to start the conversation off is by sharing with other people. If there's anybody here that would like to share um, ways, like how have you found have you found any of the issues that we've discussed in your own work and practice in historic preservation? And so we'd love to hear some stories. And they can be stories that reinforce what we're saying, and they can absolutely be stories that are counter to what we're saying, because we're here for a conversation. And Hector and I are here to learn from you as much as vice versa. So start off there. Would anybody like to share any sort of experiences that resonate? And I guess, Hillary, is I guess people can do this in the chat or maybe preferably like in
Either way,
orally or?
if they want to raise your hand first or unmute yourselves, that's totally fine. It seems like James wants
Yeah.
to. Yep.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm
Hello,
James.
James.
Hi there. I could just share with you that I grew up in Ohio, so it was very homogenized culture. And then I went to school in Denver,
Mhm.
and then I moved to Taos, New Mexico. And through that progression, moving west and into the Southwest, there's a much greater sensitivity toward all kinds of people, starting with Native Americans and then the entire Hispanic population. And in Taos specifically, there are three full-blown cultures here. Native American culture is in full swing. The Taos Pueblo is the most continually inhabited structure in North America. And it's a UNESCO site. I just live, 2 blocks away from it. And that's why I moved my children here, just so they could have that cultural connection. And then, the Spanish arrived here in the 16th century and, have a huge presence. So that's a very established community here. And then you have the Anglo community. And it's kind of a real dance for them to, live together and coordinate together. And, I think back in the mid part of this century, it was rougher then, but it works well here. And speaking of architectural conservation, what I became in love with was the adobe culture. The Taos Pueblo is made of adobes, and the Spanish all build their homes with adobes and flat roofs that always leak. And I have one in southern Colorado that's just magnificent, and it's won many awards, and the historians from every walk of life are fascinated by it. So I would imagine some of this cultural heritage pushback might stem from the East. All those academics, back East, and all their education, maybe they're just not as sensitive to, the interaction of all the different cultures. And so, my effort, if this old adobe is restored, I would like to make it a learning center for postgraduate students to come and study these subjects and write about these subjects. And so that's what I call it. I call it the adobe culture. So out here in the West, it's kind of open. That's my feeling.
Yeah. So James, thank you for sharing that. I think that's, I've heard that from a lot of people. I grew up in the West and started my preservation career out there. So there are absolutely differences. I think one of the interesting things you're talking about, I think you used the phrase adobe culture, and that immediately called to mind Santa Fe, because Santa Fe created its Adobe centric, some people use the word adobification, design guidelines in the 1950s. And that was before the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is in 66. And one of the things that there was definitely and still is to some extent a conflict there between the National Park Service and the way they wanted Santa Fe to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. There was a time period from the 1980s through the 1990s where the Park Service continually threatened to remove Santa Fe's, it's called a certified local government status. It's basically access to a limited amount of funding and support that they would get through their SPO that because they're a certified local government. But staff from the Park Service kept on hammering Santa Fe, saying, your design guidelines don't follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. You've got to change them. We're going to yank your certified local government status.
Oh,
Santa Fe, it went to some legal threats. Essentially, Santa Fe ended up winning, but it's like a multi-decade battle that the city of Santa Fe had to fight with the federal government to say, look, the orthodox doctrines and specifically public policy that you're trying to force on us, we don't accept it. We don't believe it. More importantly, our community does not want this. It took them 2 decades to fight off the federal government. It's out in the West, maybe in a different form. But I think it's fantastic that you brought up this Adobe culture because it just, boy, that really resonated with me.
Well, the famous architect, Mr. Gall Meme, are you familiar with that? He did the revival. Anyway, he's a very famous architect, and he has built a lot of the buildings he designed are at the University of New Mexico,
right.
in Albuquerque. And then he's a very famous architect. But you know, the funny thing is, I can see why Santa Fe feels that way because it's, you know, it's the earliest capital before the East.
Right.
But you have that federal overlay that's not as sensitive. But the irony is that Adobe culture is what brings people to New Mexico to visit because they're fascinated by it, and it's charming, and it's historical.
Yep.
And you know, it's just anyway, I'm gonna keep working on this Adobe culture theme because it's a real thing. And you know what happened was they settled in New Mexico, you know, in the 17th century on. And then once they were established, they came up toward Colorado. So all of these Adobe roots in Colorado come from New Mexico.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know. As Donald Trump says, we're the hottest country. Well, Santa Fe's one of the most interesting places to visit, and it's growing.
Yep. I wanted to share also, it's something related to this conversation. We're working currently with the Puerto Rico State Historic Preservation Office on basically a survey, an inventory of buildings around the islands here in the Caribbean. And when we think about those inflexible orthodox federal policies, our staff or local staff at the Puerto Rico Chipo has to negotiate basically with FEMA and other, you know, funders for this specific project, because if you look at closely at how inventories or, you know, when surveys basically are done, even the general surveys or intensive surveys, they request that you need to follow the specific set of typologies and a specific set of styles, architectural styles. And when you look at the architecture in Puerto Rico, we don't have early Georgian revival houses, you know?
Right.
And that was part of the negotiation that the Puerto Rico Chipo staff has to do with the federal government and say, hey, we need to include other, you know, vernacular styles, you know, because what you're giving us and is already stated on federal policy is not real for us. So that's also another experience of how this orthodoxy, these frameworks doesn't fit, you know, with all.
You have to be wondering how you fit in. How do you fit into the large model? Yeah, there has to be a space for you.
Yeah, and the other thing is that in Puerto Rico, we don't have buildings that are solely one architectural style. You know, maybe local architects use 3 different styles. They use revival, they use Gothic, you know, and it doesn't fit the traditional narrative. Even, you know, architectural historians now are questioning also the approach of styles, architectural styles. You know, that is something that was coined in the 19th century. But it's also we're living a specific time that we need to question ourselves about the Secretary of Interior standards, everything that is, you know, the preservation policy at it is, because we're thinking about, I mean, the Secretary of Interior standards were done in the 70s. We're in 2025, you know, and the historic preservation field has changed so much in the past 50-40 years, and we're still using these policies and these frameworks that are just not update, you know, with our needs as a societies, you know. So yeah, that's a little bit of my reason.
Jeremy, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
A university like Harvard is a very diverse, you know, inclusive university. Haven't they by now began to lobby, you know, for some of these groups that have been not represented well? Like in historic preservation, like at Harvard, aren't they teaching these new models?
Well, Harvard actually doesn't have an historic preservation program. The
Oh.
interesting thing is that there's only about 40 graduate programs in historic preservation across the country and a handful of undergraduate programs. So of like the Ivy Leagues, University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University are the only 2 that have historic preservation programs. So the interesting thing is, if I don't want to go too much in a tangent in this direction, Harvard does have, I think they still have it. It's part of their architecture program. They're looking at heritage conservation in a very open-minded way that they don't even go into it considering any of the historical genesis of it. They're sort of launching into it as if they're doing it de novo, which like from scratch. So they've done some really interesting things. It almost reminds me of like the director of Columbia's program, Otero
Otero Bailos.
Bailos.
Jorge.
Jorge, yes, who has really opened the door to creativity in historic preservation in a way that's like, wow, that's making me think. But that kind of brings us, I think, to pedagogy, because that's kind of part of what we're talking about here. You know, what there's not been a lot of inquiry into how historic preservation is actually taught in these programs. And there's actually 3 of us from all the same program. So there's a fairly good representation if we know what some of this is like. But I think before we go there, I think Amber had a question. There's a hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Delgado, and I am currently based in Chicago. I work for Landmarks, Illinois. And I just want to thank you, LHC, for hosting this webinar. And thank you, Hector and Jeremy, for your scholarship. This is a topic that's very important, and I think that these conversations need to continue to happen. It also reminded me of Erica Rami's work, because I know she's done a lot of scholarship on critiquing, you know, the standards of preservation in the United States. So I'm still like working on forming my question. I'm more so just adding to the conversation based off of my experience. Prior to moving to Chicago, I worked for the city of Boston for a grant program there that was focused on providing historic preservation grants. And we ran into issues as we were working on expanding this program and prioritizing getting more diverse contractors working on these city-funded projects. We ran into the issue of the standards being brought up and kind of like who has experience working on historic preservation projects. And I just think both what you're presented on today and Erica Rami's scholarship is so critically important because the standards have become weaponized as a tool of exclusion. And then not only in terms of like the built environment and how that impacts the built environment, but then it also impacts like trades and who can participate and get jobs working on historic buildings, who can build experience. And I just think that the clinging to standards can harm the potential of expanding preservation as an inclusive field. So I think the scholarship that you all are doing is so critically important for that reason. And then I also tying it back to Dr. Arami's work, thinking about climate as well. So she really opened my eyes to think if we like cling to these standards that were created years ago by people who didn't have to face the current climate catastrophes that we are now in present day, we're not setting anyone up for success. And the buildings that we so desperately want to protect may not even exist anymore because these standards aren't adjusting to the current times. So not a question, but I just want to thank you and add to the conversation.
Yeah, Emmer, that's great. I'm really glad you brought up Erica's work, and especially the overlap with climate change. It's been very intriguing to see how the National Park Service has not been so open to revisiting the standards in light of like, and it is a political process. You can't deny that, but still, there's a climate of intransigence in the Park Service that has been interesting to see, and it's long before the current administration. But it's not serving the needs of the American public, and I think it needs to be called out. And again, this is multi-decade issue for sure. So I was kind of curious. I know we've got at least one educator on here. I know. Is there anybody here who has been somehow involved in preservation education, either receiving it or being part of the delivery of it, that has seen any of these issues unfold, or how would you address this in what you teach? I'm not ready to call anybody out in particular, but if you have anything to share, it would be absolutely wonderful.
Andrea.
So let's
Hi.
do Andrea first and then Brooks, Jeffrey after. Okay, cool.
Okay. So I'm gonna call Cindy out because she's listening, she's on, and we've talked about this several times, like because I go to USC and she teaches there. Our communication, we talk about preservation in a very passionate way, where when, like the YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard people, they're like, very quick to say, you're living in the past. They have very short statements. And when we go to talk about preservation, we're pouring our hearts out. And so Cindy wrote a communication guide. She can help us all to speak more frankly and directly about preservation. And I think our messaging is so important in this day and age because nobody wants to listen to, a 15-minute lecture or, about why preservation is good. The world is changing and everything's moving fast and we have to move with it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brooks Jeffrey. I'm with the University of Arizona. And Jeremy, it's good to see you. And Hector, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm really impressed with the article that you sent out. And I just wanted to comment and took the prompt from Jeremy to talk about how I think it's really beholden of educators to take this standard and the standard meaning the baton and be able to take it into the classroom and really imbue in the students this ethic of how we move forward. And it really is an ethic. It's a mindset to challenge the kind of standard set of protocols that exist. We here in Tucson, Arizona, like my colleague James in Taos, we're a border community. which means that we have migrant communities, migrant populations coming in, transforming what might be historic districts. And that to kind of freeze those places in time is doing a disservice to the identity that each subsequent layer of the community brings to a sense of identity and vibrancy to a community. And so it's really about adaptation. And Jeremy, you and I talked about this before, you know, the idea of conservation as adaptation really needs to be, I think, brought into the fold of that. And then secondly, this idea of what I would call vernacular landscapes, right? This idea of how transformed landscapes, whether they're neighborhoods, then need to tell these stories as they evolve over time. And again, allowing for that flexibility and evolution of the built environment, and recognize whether they're ethnic groups or other kind of populations that define those over a period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Cindy. Thank you, Andrea, and it's good to see you. And I want to acknowledge Jeremy. Great to see you, Jeremy, who was a great peer reviewer and contributor to this messaging guide that Andrea mentioned, that we did for the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. I guess I'm spoiled being on the West Coast. I mean, I know Erica at Columbia, and Kennedy Whiters worked with her in the spring on a studio that, you know, she's done a lot of stuff with racial justice and the Tenderloin and, you know, other case studies. So I'm really inspired by that work, not to mention LHC and AAPI HIP, who are just like, you know what? We're just going to go do this. We're not asking permission. We're not going to do this. We're just going to do this. And I can't tell you guys how inspiring that is to us old white people. And yeah, I will say that I ran the summer course in heritage conservation this past year, and it was like the fundamentals class condensed into 2 weeks. And there was a lot of, in the intro, there's a lot of, you know, how we got here, right? So this is why we do preservation this way in the US. And it was all, you know, Ruskin and Leduc and, you know, all this stuff. And it made me sort of sick, like watching it. But I do think it's really important to acknowledge that, but also, you know, we had a class on collaborating with communities and equity, and we went out to a site of the Mafundi building in Watts and did Black Heritage. And, you know, so I think I don't think it's just on the West Coast. I know people in Austin are doing really amazing work, in San Antonio. But what else was I going to say? Oh, and then one of our documentation class in the spring plugged into the National Trust Women's Landmarks Project. And Andrea is one of the students who dug up new information on women who are excluded from existing landmark nominations at the local level. So I certainly am not meaning to be defensive, but I'm saying this is a really important context and a baseline for everybody in the field to understand why the field works the way it does. But I do think it's changing. So is it just me? Is it a West Coast thing? Am I spoiled? Is this the exception?
So I think so, Cindy. So I think what most people, so I'm going to make a generalizable claim here that I think is hopefully true. Most people in the preservation field have seen an absolute opening of discussions around like equity and diversity and inclusion in historic preservation. And some really important things have started to change in terms of like how National Register nominations are created and researched, right? Because there's been a big push. And in fact, I think the funding might still be available from the Park Service, and I'm sure for like underrepresented communities. But that talk has absolutely and sorely needed. It's been happening, which is absolutely fantastic. And I think that's been countrywide. And I've absolutely seen that in historic preservation programs, the way that students are taught and about this. The interesting question is this, though. Are the issues around diversity and inclusion and equity in historic preservation simply representation? because that's where most of the effort and the funding has been focused. If somehow we can just get more representative national register nominations, or you can say at the local level, local district and individually designated local properties, well, then we've solved the problem. And what Héctor and I are saying in this paper is that it's a systemic problem ingrained in the doctrine and ingrained in public policy. That door is very firmly locked amongst the policy leaders. And again, I'm trying to exclude, it's not the current administration. This is something that's been in place for decades. So the question is how to open that door. And I think Cindy, you mentioned this. I think the way it's being opened is that people are just moving forward. And I think it's kind of curious to think, will historic preservation evolve into something that isn't directly related to public policy? Because it's already going in that way. I mean, Americans have always done that. We see something that needs to happen and we make it happen, and government will follow, hopefully at some point. But yeah, it's these are interesting questions. I think Andrea's got her another question.
Andrea.
I think Andrea, you have your hand up.
With people of color, with communities that are, somehow not mainstream, there's erasure in many ways. There's historically been takings, and like I come from a mining town. Cindy's probably like covering her ears right now because she's heard it so many times. But the company, like when they had to expand the mine, they just took away the town. And then I went to high school in Phoenix, and Phoenix did the same thing. They took all of Central South Phoenix because, quote unquote, they were expanding the airport, which they never did. So, there is just a ton of erasure. So there's these power politics that go into it where we cannot preserve our communities because they're going to tear them down so that developers can redevelop and make money. And that's, I did my whole thesis on this and I can say it in a sentence, but it's, we need to collectively, we need to own our neighborhoods. Otherwise, they will be taken.
Hillary.
Yeah, not to promote Latinos in heritage conservation, but that's one of the things that we're doing. We did launch the Latino equity study, and we need metrics in order to know, to sell it, to advocate for it. So we were able to make public the first phase of the equity study, and we just identified that we just increased very little from 10 years ago. Taylor, our executive director, part of her thesis was to do the equity study. So we were able to update that this year, and we're just less of 1.1%. So I think that has been one of the critical issues is also site identification. As Andrea was mentioning, we have a lot of sites that were erased by urban renewal. All these urban planning projects that completely erase communities, and the only way that we'll be able to first to know and to learn is through oral histories. And a lot of these are community elders that neither speak the language or they pass away, unfortunately, and those memories are not carrying down through generations. So that's part of our many programs are to provide that first to learn and to know about it. For example, like the Phoenix airport that Andrea was mentioning, that's one of my sites that I've been doing research on, that one of the oldest Mexican American neighborhoods were completely destroyed by the expansion of the airport. And there's only one remaining church that is gated. No one knows what is going to happen with it. So we have journalists on the ground that are capturing these oral histories from members. And, we have one of our grantees this year is called Arizona Barrio Stories, who is creating that platform to elevate those stories. So I think in many ways, Latinos got tired of trying to be heard. So we just create our own space, and we're just very fortunate that we have our founders, well, they were part of the Chicano movement, so they had the guts to to start a preservation movement, and hopefully, through advocacy, through education, we can elevate those stories. But if when we look at all these issues, systemically issues, it's very similar in the Black community and the Asian community. We all share the same symptoms of the same phenomena. It's just that we need to be in the same room, be like, yeah, we know what is that about. It's policy issues. And one of the things I appreciated a lot about the paper, one is when you call out that the personal values of the authors, original, scholars on the field. Of course, I learned preservation theories in grad school, but I realized I never critically thought about, like, what are the personal values of these thinkers, and how has that formed in our world building and our own practice. And one thing I was telling you earlier was that my preservation brain is constantly pushing the envelope, like, yeah, but what about this? Our community has this, how we can cross that. And I think that comes with my issues with EDI efforts has been othering, kind of an add-on instead of being the center of the conversation. We don't have to be a sideline. Like, our story is way beyond the construct of a nation state like the United States, where the borderlands existed way before. So things like that is kind of hopefully our goal for Latino Heritage Conservation is to put that as the center, so we can actually think about how to deconstruct our notions of policy and preservation in general. And I'm gonna stop there. Cindy.
No, don't. I just want to say that's you have to give people an alternative. And even though we always say they're just guidelines, we can't help ourselves but use them as checklists, meaning the standards, right? And that's where the grants come from and everything. So what you guys are doing in just building up a parallel universe, that has your own grants and, your own projects and your own standards for what is important is crucial, because maybe the government's evisceration of the field will make us change somehow. Maybe there's an opportunity here, but otherwise it's going to have to be just people just doing the work and recognizing that, you've always done the work. People have always taken care of their communities. We never called it preservation before, but yeah. And it's not just representation, 100%, Jeremy.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if Amber, if I know you got your hand up, but give me a second here, because Hillary has mentioned something, and Cindy as well. This relates to education, but it's and I haven't published on this, but I've done a survey of the syllabi of historic preservation programs across the country and what they're actually teaching in terms of especially the idea of sort of the founding fathers of historic preservation. And like everybody learns about not Camilo Boito, actually, Viollet-le-Duc and Ruskin, and it just sort of drops off there. And then we go to a total US centric position, and the ladies of Mount Vernon, and like as if the world doesn't exist. But we miss people like actually a really important person to help pass the National Historic Preservation Act. His name was Raines. He was a politician. He was also a staunch segregationist. There were people who were involved in creating, it's a chain that ended up being the Secretary of the Interior Standards. There's a really odd and surprising number of fascists who were involved in that. And so when you get to the personal, you have to be careful about conflating, did these people's personal values get into the doctrines? You can't deny that probably, right? But you don't know to what extent. But preservation students do not critically learn about their own past. And that's what needs to change in education. So anyways, I just wanted to say that, but Amber, please.
Yeah, to that point, my question was going to be just for everyone on the call, like, is anyone aware of any current efforts to expand not only the standards, but just in general, how preservation is practiced in the United States, like getting it away from that Eurocentric focus and including influences from other places, like the global South? Like, are those conversations happening in the field?
I can jump in on that. I don't think those conversations are happening actively right now. I do think that the global South is doing a lot in terms of adapting their own practices, and developing their own frameworks and methodologies. And most of it is because we don't have the resources that the global North has. And that is another whole conversation, because if you look at the methodologies and you look at the techniques that we use for preservation and conservation, are just framing Europe or North America, or where you have a lot of resources, a lot of scholarship, versus, for example, a place like Puerto Rico that we need a lot of resources and a lot of people to do stuff. The other aspect that I must mention is that we have to deal with preservation and conservation seen as something technical. And when you talk, for example, to other professionals in the field, like art conservators, and they predominantly think about this as a technical thing, not an ideological, that is not embedded within an ideological framework. And that is something that we need to actively discuss and think about, because once we think our job is only technical, we are just shutting down the conversation about how we do it, why we do it, for whom we do this. So yeah, I think that's part of the issue that we need to also consider, how that everything that we do has a ideological background. Yeah.
I think actually Hillary, I think did I see Karina had her hand raised at one point? Did I see that?
Karina, I think, was like clapping, but
Oh, I was clapping. I'm sorry. Okay, well,
if she wants to talk, she's very smart, very brilliant. Karina will get to talk. She's like in the chat, very active.
No, hola, everyone. I'm technically supposed to be out, so I'm trying to stay quiet so my coworkers don't get too upset with me and tell me to have boundaries. But this is such a good conversation that I was like, no, I want to listen. But no, I just want to applaud everyone for the conversation and tell you all that we're listening. As I said in the chat, my background's urban planning, right? So when Hillary and I started working together, we started having really amazing but difficult conversations of what I was taught, what she was taught, and how we can come together and collaborate and keep dismantling fields and practices that really made it difficult for the both of us. So again, applauding everyone. I'm just really excited to be here and to hear the conversation.
No, it's no, Karina, I have like the most, she's the other side of my brain. That's how we talk all the time. But actually, one of the things that we discuss a lot when we do, especially field work, and something echoing what Hector was saying, I think there's a huge emphasis in becoming, experts and professional technicians in our work. But ultimately, our work is so inherently connected to culture, and that you need to be a good steward and be active in the community, not treat people like test subjects. You have to engage. So one of the things that I think inherently in the work that we do, but also even as individual professionals, like Karina and I is a good example, because we incorporate a lot of participatory processes in the work that we do, like be extremely transparent and communicative, and how to make them part of the process in preserving their own culture that is reflective on their lived experiences, and how you even want to preserve it. Does it have an expiration date? Things like that, like, takes time, but it should be part of the process. If you want to expand the narratives, and if you really, because there's no blueprint, especially because we never had the time for it. So I think, like, to think about the future of preservation that is more equitable, we have to create these processes more collectively. I think we've been too focused in names and people, who is the genius, who is the pioneer, but ultimately these stories are preserved by collectives and like groups. A lot of our stories that we're preserving, they're entire community collectives that been doing decades of advocacy. So we're trying to make space for all those voices to be able to expand the significance of this place that is beyond the building. It is about the neighborhood. It is about all the arts that all the kids. So how to share those things is how we can balance protecting both tangible and intangible heritage. It's like how culinary heritage, like recipes, is tied to restaurant, and how does restaurant create culture in the neighborhood? Things like that. It's a little massaging, but it's not until we have the conversation, both with different community partners, but also expertise, like conversation with a planner and an architect, etc., helps to create a very holistic view of a place. So I think that's my 50 cents. We just need to collaborate more. I think that would be the great answer. Do you think, Jeremy?
Oh, I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, so much of what defines many of the problems in historic preservation is not the discipline, that it's unique to this discipline. All of these areas of practice, have these divides and the silos, and this group isn't talking to this group. So the more that you can do that, I mean, absolutely the better. And I think, I'll give a plug to Latinos and Heritage Conservation. I mean, I think you guys have been uniquely among many preservation advocacy organizations doing this in a way that really is elevating communities, that's centering participation in a way that is stupendous. So it's great to see. I mean, you really, I think, a paradigm for other organizations to follow. So,
If there's any last, existential questions for amazing experts? No? James, are you gonna say goodbye? It's so good to see you.
No, I was gonna say something.
Okay,
Can you hear
go
me?
ahead.
If this effort was underway in the last administration, when the Department of Interior Secretary was Deb Haaland, I would think anyone in this world would, be open-minded to these concepts. Is anyone familiar if she was approached about these ideas? Deb Haaland, the former Secretary of the Interior, is she a decision maker, getting some of these procedures and standards opened up?
so unless anybody else has something to add on that. So all I can say is that this is a bit like through the grapevine, but people I know at the Park Service, technically, yes, because the Secretary of the Interior absolutely has authority over what the Park Service does in historic preservation, in that particular department that focuses on it. But there's been very little historical leadership and connection between those two groups. And it's often because it's different paradigms, different worlds, right? And Deb Haaland was it's what she was focusing on was critically important, but it's like, maybe the way I'm trying to say is it's difficult to expect one person to do everything, and for her to focus on everything, because what she was focusing on with indigenous peoples absolutely needed to be done. I mean, can
Yeah.
you fault her because she didn't tackle what her preservation program is doing in the Park Service? I mean, how much can you ask one person to do? Because she was doing good work. But politically within the Park Service, the preservation program is uniquely isolated from influence, is the only way that I can put it. And there's actually been some sociocultural studies on the political, not the work culture in the Park Service that defines it in ways that might make it just more resistant to change than other types of government agencies. So there's all sorts of things that you can unpack and discover. But in short, the Secretary of the Interior has traditionally had very little influence over what happens in the Park Service and preservation. In the short.
I will add that, yeah, that's part of definitely of the issue, because the Park Service and the Department of Interior is so big. They manage both natural and cultural resources. So now the what to think about, and the attention span for everything is really short. But also we must question other more as the state level. For example, we have the state historic preservation officers in every state and territory, and they have even a conference of state historic preservation officers. My question is, what are they aware of these conversations? Are they open to have these conversations and changes, at least at the state level, state and local level, both? I think the conversation, we don't need to wait for for the changes to come from top to bottom. I think we should think about how we can start changing everything from the bottom to up, and it should be, I think it's a great conversation to have with the state historic preservation officers, with local officials, and other agencies such as the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, because it has a lot of ramifications and it impacts a lot of both the state and federal government agencies.
Okay, I think we hit the hour. This is an amazing conversation. I want to keep it going, but this is not the end. We have future webinars that you should come. We have cafecitos. We will continue staying connected. So thank you so much for amazing experts to lead the conversation. And I'm gonna leave that now to wrap it up. Rene, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you once again to everybody for joining us. This has been Reforming Architectural Conservation, una plática. And let me tell you, the plática estuvo buena. It was very good. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Jeremy Wells and Héctor Berdecía-Hernández. Like Hillary said, definitely thank you to our members. Please consider becoming a member, because we do have our Cafecitos con LHC this month with Jennifer Rivera Velez, Thursday, July 1st. And of course, save the date for our next one, where we will be having a conversation with staff from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. So like Hillary said, the conversation continues. Once again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to our esteemed panelists as well. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.